And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have on Christy Chavers Stutzman, who wrote a great book about being involved in politics. The title of the book is The Spiritual Price of Political Silence. I'm sure that got a few people's attention as they looked at the title. Christy, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
So looking forward to jumping into kind of the big idea for the episode as we head into 2024. Of course, we all know it's election season coming up. And so what is the responsibility of the Christian, the concerned citizen? What can we do in our communities? And so that's going to be the topic that we talk about today. Mrs. Christy Stutzman is a small business owner, music composer, former teacher, and state legislator. This is how I met her originally. She has written for multiple news organizations, including the Washington Times, Daily Signal, featured opinion writer for the Washington Stand by Family Research Council. As the wife of a member of Congress, she's traveled widely on diplomatic delegations, has been a strong advocate for conservative, pro family causes on Capitol Hill. She's also been a featured radio and podcast guest, a speaker at political Christian and pro life events. She also does a lot of work in the Christian dramatic space. Her and her husband live in Howe, Indiana, with their sons Peyton and Preston. So, Chrissy, I may ask you. I've kind of gone through your formal bio there, but anything else that you'd like to just share with the audience as far as what led you to speak into politics, what brought you to interest in this area?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of people's question is, how did you first get involved? And my background, of course, is music, composer, fine arts teacher. So I never saw myself getting really as involved as my husband and I did in politics. However, when we first were married, we were excitedly making plans, just like every young married couple does, of what God had us to do and what he had gifted us to do. And I was excited to delve into writing music and helping fine arts teachers across the country. And my husband was building his business. He had several businesses and agribusiness related type of things. And he really enjoyed that. But when 9/11 happened, we had a 3-week-old son. He was our first son. And we were sitting there holding our son at my grandmother's house, actually, and watching the events unfold that day. It was very, everybody remembers where they were, but it was one of those moments in our young lives where we just decided that no matter what happened, we were going to be a little more involved in our community. We needed to know who was in charge so that if our community were ever in a crisis, we knew it was in good hands and we had good leadership. So we just started showing up to different meetings. We went to, a commissioner's meeting. We went to a local GOP meeting, and we went to just a bunch of community meetings, just trying to meet people who were in leadership and just reassure ourselves that it was in good hands and also just offer ourselves to help. And when you do that, I've learned that God opens doors and presents opportunities that you don't expect. And so Marlon was approached by our local judge's wife at a GOP meeting, and she said, we're looking to fill the ballot. I think it was in the primary, and she said, we don't have someone to run for state representative. And we looked at the race, and we believed that Marlon could actually speak into that and make a difference with his Christian worldview, with his understanding of how business worked and how it affected local businesses. Our business, in particular, had been hit by some bureaucratic nonsense that had cost us money, and it was very frustrating. So we decided to run, not thinking we would win, but just to kind of get our name out there, so that if we ever ran, we might be able to serve. And as the Lord would have it, he won by 249 votes.
Oh, wow.
And that's how we got involved. It happened at a little, courthouse like you see scattered across Indiana at the local, it was LaGrange County Courthouse, actually. And back in that day, they would bring in the ballots in duffel bags, and then they would count them. And then they had a big chalkboard out in the foyer, and they would write down on a grid who got so many votes and this in this precinct. And everybody had their clipboard. So it was definitely small town America at work. And it was a beautiful thing to see. And he actually won by more votes than I've seen some people win on the local level, but it was still close.
Mm,
And the gentleman that he defeated in that race came in, shook his hand, congratulated him. It was very peaceful, cordial, civil.
mm,
And so, going into writing this book, having watched my husband served at the State House, in Congress, having served myself in the State House, and having a front row view of a lot of things over the years, I realized the beauty of that exchange, of that
mm,
race, and the beauty of American governance in general. But one thing that really captivated me from there on was that everyone can make a difference. Everyone can do something. And it's not that just that we can do it, it's that as Americans and as people of faith, it is our birthright to do it. And if we don't do it, we're not fulfilling what we should be doing as citizens of a country whose government is we the people. So that's a little of my journey.
So there was an element throughout the book that I really appreciated, and it was this concept of stewardship that we didn't fight in the Revolutionary War, and as I even think about the state of Indiana, other listeners from other states, you just go look at some of the pioneer history of your states and just how difficult life was for these people. And here we sit,
Yes.
at our warm mega mansions. It's relation to even if you're on a modest income, you're probably a much larger place than even some of our pioneer families.
Right.
And then I just think of Christians kind of throughout the ages, even around the world. And we have this incredible gift called citizenship in the United States that allows us to vote, to have meaningful influence. And that demands more than a shrug
Yes.
from American Christians. And so I was encouraged by that. But you took this concept in a way that I had not thought about much, and that is, how does America's kind of spiritual health and even civic health, how does that impact the rest of the world? And so I was thinking of this concept of stewardship, and I think about it here, but you kind of took it beyond even around the world. Would you kind of share that story and that thought?
Yeah. My eyes were really open to that. As my husband served in Congress, we were allowed to go on what was called diplomatic congressional delegation visits to different countries. And the goal there and the mission was to create understanding, to create dialogue with countries that we might not have a strong history with. For instance, we visited a lot of Eastern Bloc countries who are sometimes overshadowed by the size of Russia, former USSR members, and now they are independent and they're governing themselves and they're trying to implement the principles that you see in America and our governance. And so we were trying to establish relationships with them, whether it was diplomatic or trade related, any number of things. And as I traveled and visited different countries with my husband on a couple trips that we went on, it was amazing to hear the perspective of other people on America's influence in the world. One particular was a gentleman he was a guide in Israel for us. And we were blessed to have a group of people who were serving with us in our Marlon's freshman class. This was the first year he was in Congress, and we had all been part of a Bible study and a prayer group together. We were all definitely having fellowship with each other in the Word. And as we went through, all the different places in the Holy Land, it was such a blessing. And we got to the Mount of Beatitudes. The guide had us read Matthew 5. Now, he had made sure that we knew he was not religious. He was Jewish by birth and he was a citizen of Israel, but he was not a practicing religious Jew in any way. He did not practice any religion. And so, but he did a good job of presenting, all these different locations and the history and the biblical context. So we read Matthew 5. My husband volunteered to read it. And when we got to the part that said, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and be trodden under foot of men." And then it says, "Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set in a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light it to put it under a bushel, but put it on a candlestick, and it gives light unto all that are in the room." And it was a moment where you realize this is the place where Jesus said this for the
Mm.
first time. And
Wow.
it was also a verse that the Pilgrim Fathers had tried to implement in what they did. It was one of the reasons they came to these shores, was that they wanted to exercise their own conscience freely in worshiping God, but they also wanted to be a light to the world, that from these shores, the glorious light of the gospel should shine throughout all the world. So it was a very poignant moment for us. And of course, several of us were choked up,
Mm.
wiping tears away. And then the guide looked at us and he said, I just want to say, as leaders of your country, you need to know that you have done this thing that Jesus said. You've been a light to the world. But I want to ask you,
Wow.
as a citizen of Israel, please don't stop.
Mm.
He said, if you stop, I don't know who will take your place. And I don't know who will step forward and do the same thing you've done. And I just was overwhelmed with the realization that, it's not just about our kids and our freedom and our grandkids and the next generation. It's not about, having the freedom that we need to worship God and to exercise our religious liberties and our freedom of speech. It's not just about that. The world is watching, and we have had an influence in the world. And then I started thinking about all of the missions and the disaster relief and the educational things that we have done, and just the good that we've been able to do around the world because of the freedom that we experience. And the fact that people are recognizing it and saying, yeah, you did that thing that Jesus told you to do, but please don't stop. Uh, Conversely, I was also presented with the realization that they're starting to watch the foundations crumble. When we visited the Eastern Bloc countries, which a lot are still Orthodox. They're very conservative. There was one country that they were encouraging their young people not only to have children and have large families, but for the third child of each family of a married couple, they were allowed to bring their child in for a special blessing into the main church there in their capital city by the cardinal who was in charge of their whole church, because they were trying to encourage healthy, larger families, and in church attendance. It was great to hear that. What wasn't great to hear was that, a member of their parliament came up to Marlon and said, we want to do trade with you. And he started talking about all of their things that they want to sell to us, they want to do trade with America. And then he said, but the one thing that we love your exports, we buy this and that, but please don't export your morals anymore. You're ruining our
Mm.
children.
Oh, well.
So that was, yes, we have done good. We have done great things around the world. We've been salt and light, but
Mm.
we're also being watched by the world as we are declining. And so it gave me pause to
Mm.
realize it's not just about us. It's about the responsibility that we having been blessed, to not be blinded by our abundance, to not allow the anarchy of the mind and the heart that we see permeating our culture right now to be what we export to the world. Um, we need to continue the good work that we've been doing.
Amen. I just thought that was such a powerful reminder to us, especially as we look at 2024. It's going to be loud, it's going to be noisy. And there's such a temptation for American Christians to just be like, that's dirty. I'm just going to stay over here in my, I sometimes say, a church-shaped bunker. I don't want to go out there
Yep.
into the fray. But that for whatever reason, and it's not because we're anything special, but I think it's because the founders relied on biblical principles, that if you follow biblical principles, guess what? It leads to flourishing. And then God has given us a remarkable presence in the world right now. And again, just that idea of just shrugging it off and, oh, we have nothing to say here. It it doesn't realize kind of the situation that we're in, all the way back to that idea of stewardship. So I just thought that was
Yeah.
such a great reminder for American Christians as we head into this year. So, what was one of the assumptions the founders made? We talked a lot on the podcast about the history of the United States. And for American Christians, sometimes they get, the founding era kind of thrown back at them. The way that I will often think through it and talk about it is, here are the individuals that set up this remarkable political machine with the separation of powers, etc. And so if we're trying to figure out how this thing worked, how it should work, probably should look at the people that designed it and what they said about it. And so I thought this is a great way to frame the American system. So you mentioned that there was an assumption that they made. And so if you would talk about that assumption, and then kind of how well versed colonial era Americans were in the scriptures.
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about this one assumption that I think that the founders made. And the one assumption was that people of faith would always be involved in our government and in politics, which goes together. I mean, you can't get elected without running for office, so there has to be some politicking going on. So they assumed that people of faith would be involved, and I think they assumed that based on their closeness to, at that time, would have been great grandparents or great great grandparents who came to this country seeking religious freedom. They were chased out of Europe almost. I know mine were when I did my research, and my
Mm.
husband's as well, and so many others that I know. Their original grandparents who came here during the colonial era came because they had been chased out of their own homes, and these weren't, the scum of Europe. These weren't people that were coming out of the jails. These were educated, very devout, very serious people who had risked everything and had actually lost a whole lot in order to come here. I know my ancestors on my mom's side, who for with William Penn, with his great movement,
Wow.
spent the first. I mean, they were from a good family. I mean, they had a nice estate over in England. They actually had a title, and they were harried and harassed and investigated and taxed extra and robbed from by their government. And so
Mm.
they came here and lived in a cave for the first year.
Wow.
And the Native Americans helped them survive. And they lived in peace for many, many years. It was an amazing story to read. And I thought, why? Why would they risk all that? Well, because they were people that were principled, that believed in the scriptures and what they taught, and they had done their study and they were convicted of it. And so, as you look at American history, which has been twisted and hidden and chopped up and misrepresented.
Mhm.
We're blessed to have the original documents and the original words of many people. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, we have it's the second largest collection of genealogical books in the country,
Mm.
next to Salt Lake City, Utah. If you go in there, I went in there with, maybe three names of great grandparents that I knew, and that was it. And I walked out with 10 books on each side, at least, if not
Wow.
more. And I had never known anything about my ancestors. But what's important to know about our history is their words. It's important to know their motivations and why they did what they did. And we still have access to that. And I think,
Mm.
with the internet and all the search engines that we have and the use, let's do it. Let's remind ourselves of the truth. And so as I studied American history and the founding documents and the facts that are out there, which we all should study, the fact is the American colonies were full of people who were intellectual giants. They in their homeschooled environment, which they had to do back in the day before they really started getting going, they were studying Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and they were studying elocution, and they were studying, penmanship. They were studying the history of the world and governments and law. I mean, the most common books in the American colonial time in each home were the Bible and what's his name? It's a book of law, British common law. So they were studying. I think it was John Locke or some one of the guys
And
who was.
Blackstone. Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
Blackstone's. Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
Blackstone's book of common law, British common law. Most of the immigrants at that time were from the British Isles, but there were others from other places. But the British common law gave the most freedom of any one country in the world at that point. And so it would make sense that they would be studying the philosophy of that, and they would also study the governance of ancient Rome and Greece and all those as civilizations to figure out what worked and what didn't, and why didn't it work, and what would be better. And that was the whole conversation. The other thing I was just encouraged and heartened about was how much they knew the nature of God.
Mm.
They knew his name so well. And of course, secular historians are trying to say they used all these different names of God because they were trying to be more secular, which is nothing could be further from the truth. They were actually using the names of God to apply to different subjects that they were talking about, because God in their minds applied to everything. And
Mm.
so God's name was very important, but knowing the specific name that he used to refer to himself on different subjects and in different situations takes study. It takes understanding the scriptures. So these people knew the scriptures. They knew the Hebrew and the Greek, and they studied Latin to understand the Roman histories. We're able to read that. And as you study John Quincy Adams, as you study Benjamin Talmadge, who was in charge of intelligence for Washington in the Revolution, um, Witherspoon was an incredible intellect. There were so many that we can't even fathom, the intellect that was there. And so it's really important for us to remind ourselves of that, because we don't know the truth, and how can we defend it? We have to know it first in order to be able to speak truth.
I had, two big takeaways from that section of the book. And the first one was, and I think Adams kind of summarized it when he said that the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. I often think of it as, if you have self-government, it requires self-control. And so they just assume that that's what we'd have. And now everyone wants to
They
have their own
assumed it, yeah.
truth and,
Out of
no,
self-defense.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I
And
mean, it
then
was
the,
almost like they assumed that people of faith would be involved out of self-defense,
mm,
but also to preserve, and out of
yeah.
just sheer gratitude and also duty. So there were multiple reasons why they assumed that. I think they also assumed it because they knew that mankind is sinful and that they weren't perfect. And
Mm,
they truly believed that if people were seeking to be moral and seeking to follow God, then those people would also see the problems with society and try to address them. And that ended up happening. Now, one of those societal sins, we fought a war over.
mm.
And there was great loss of life because of it. I don't think the founders could have foreseen that, but I do know that they understood that they were not perfect and that there were still problems that needed to be addressed. And so they were hoping that moral people would be involved.
So good. And the other thing that I took away was just the knowledge of Scripture. And you read any of the founders. I mean, it's just the air that they breathe, the biblical language that they use. And for listeners, you'll have to buy the book. There's this amazing letter from George Washington that Christy set out in the book. We'll have a link to the book in the show notes that you can purchase. That I thought just set that out so well. And when we think of relationship with church and state, certainly one of the things when I talk to church leaders about is, if the Barna studies are correct, something like 7 or 8% of American Christians have a biblical worldview. Whatever that number is not good.
Yeah.
And so, giving American citizens, American Christians, that biblical foundation is so important.
Yeah.
So moving on to kind of our role now, I often hear this statement, and you said it out in your book as well, like, for American Christians, I don't do politics. And so what is the Christian's role now, especially in the present crisis in American public life?
Well, a lot of times we are inundated from the news and TV commercials, radio, newspapers. I mean, you name it. It's just, I feel like we're just immersed in negative and shocking, headlines where they're trying to get our attention, and they're trying to tell us that this is the way the world is. So just get used to it. I mean, we could really get to the point where we feel like the battle's lost. And
Mm,
as I did some research for the book, it was really heartening and encouraging to realize that the battle is not lost. The structure is still there, and we still have the ability to be involved. Now, during the American Revolution, and in other conflicts as well, it wasn't a majority that was involved. It was a minority. But it was a minority who were solid in what they believed and why they believed it, and they stood firm, and they stood strong, and they actually took action. So the structure of our government is that we the people elect our leaders. I have a lot of questions from people that say, and even in the media, as I'm doing interviews, they'll say, do you think our leaders should be doing more? They point out some terrible thing that's happening, and they say, do you think our leaders should be doing more? And my answer to that is, well, we are our leaders, and yes, we should be doing more.
that's good.
We are the people, And if the leaders that we have elected right now, who have an end to their term, are not doing well, then we also have the responsibility to take action. So if they are not doing well, we need to know why. We need to follow what their votes are. We need to follow what their stance is. And we need to share that with our friends and family. And we need not to be afraid to speak out and say, okay, I'm changing the rule at grandma's house and I'm going to talk about religion and politics. And the reason I'm going to talk about religion and politics is because, well, if I don't, somebody else will. And so you need to hear from me why I believe what I believe. Now that's going to take preparation on our part. It's going to take study. We're going to have to know the founding. We're going to have to know current events. We're going to have to know issues, bills that are coming up. So this is going to take extra time. Now, what I say in the book is that it is easier than you think, because just as Marlon and I found out, as you take the time to find out when your next school board meeting is, or you take the time to find out when the commissioners are meeting, or, the city council or something, that's going to take time out of your schedule. But what you'll find is if you attend a couple times or more, you will realize that these people are people, and business owners, they're parents, they're citizens, and they're just trying to make a difference. Now, you might see that you have a difference with them in their worldview and the way they present the issues. And you will find that you're not quite as intimidated once you see that this structure that was established by, the founders, it works. And it's a grassroots up. The other thing that I point out is the fact that if you do not vet people who are running at the lower levels, and I'm talking about front lines, I call like the city council and the school board front lines of politics, because they are dealing with huge amounts of money, decisions to make on those amounts of money, and they are also probably going to run for something else in the future. So if you say, well, it doesn't matter. Let's say that you're a pro-life person, right? You believe that life is precious, and you want to, you believe what God believes, that life is precious and it's a gift from God. So you want to see people elected who believe in that same way. But you look at the school board and you say, well, I know this person from such and such. They'll say you were in high school with them or something. And but they say that they're pro-abortion. They're not pro-life, but they're running for school board, so they're not going to have to deal with that issue. Beware, because when that person has served in the school board, many times they will run for city county council. And there's a lot of things that have been passed on city county council that affect the pro-life movement, and they affect that issue. And they might even run for state representative, which again, you're going to be dealing with the pro-life issue there. So if you don't vet them in the beginning, you have less of a chance of removing them from office or from the political, sphere in the next election, because they have established name recognition with people. They've established a track record. They might have done a great job as a school board member, but if they get to a level where they're having to deal with pro-life issues, you know that when you first supported them and you knew they weren't pro-life, you know that they're probably not going to change a whole lot, because they were clear from the beginning where they stood. So it's really important to vet people in the beginning, even at those beginning levels. Even if you think they might not deal with some of the issues that are close to your heart, it's still important, because they could run for something else in the future. So it's doable. And it's very easy to get involved, especially today. I mean, you've got like email and websites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You can reach out to their campaign manager, their campaign staff. You can walk in a parade for them. You can knock on doors, make phone calls, whatever they're doing. But as you get involved with their campaigns, you are going to have access to them as they continue to serve. So it's something that we can all be involved in, and we should be involved in for the sake of our future.
I often will remark and kind of have conversations with others that sometimes it seems to me that those in the more progressive side think in generations while we think in elections.
Yes.
And what I appreciate about your book is that you're, in a sense, kind of trying to change the culture of how Christians engage in government, and don't look at it as, oh, great, I'm going to go vote. Like, if that's all you're doing, that's great. Please keep doing that.
Right. Yes.
But that is a gross oversimplification of how the process works. And what if we're instilling in our children, hey, part of what our family does, we're all in with our local church, but we're all in with our community. And you have a really helpful battery of questions. I won't go through all of them, but just on questions of, how often did you as a child go to meet your elected officials, and do you know who's involved at the local level? And so these are questions that I think our families need to be answering, and then we can engage moving on. And I certainly have found that everything in the political arena moves at the speed of relationships. And so do we know these individuals? Because if you do know them and they know that you care about them as a person, and then they're wrestling with something difficult, they may bring you in, or maybe they'll have a conversation with you about, all right, where does this need to go next?
Yeah.
In the book, you mentioned a conversation with, I believe, a young mom who understandably super busy with little kids, and it was kind of saying, "Hey, I don't have time for this," but had all of these concerns about what was being taught in the schools and about life. And I just thought it was so great that you're able to kind of turn back and say, "Look, what many people consider kind of quote unquote political often boils down to worldview, and we can make a difference in our community." So I so appreciated that, just very practical aspect of the book. Now, since we are in 2024, what are your specific thoughts? What would be your encouragement to committed Christians as well as church leaders as we're facing down the presidential election and everything that's going on this year?
Yeah, so this year is a pivotal year, I think, in the history of our country. We've all seen the chaos that's happening in our culture, and we're kind of scratching our heads like, where did this come from? And it's been kind of surprising to me as I did some research to find out that it's been around for longer than I really thought. It's been around for about 100 years. And what I found was that we have been targeted. America specifically has been targeted by cultural Marxists who came here around the turn of the century, maybe 1930-ish, maybe a little bit before. And they were intellectual elites who had bought in completely to the humanistic, evolutionary worldview. And they truly believed that man could evolve himself to the point where he was transhuman. And this was radical. It was very fringe at the time. But what they did, and you mentioned this, a lot of times we think according to elections or next year, and it seems like the other side thinks generationally. That's what they have done. And so we're seeing played out in the lives of our children, whether it's in school or whether it's in the media, entertainment, any number of places that they go online, they're going to be inundated with this humanistic evolutionary worldview. And we really need to be aware in this election that there is more at stake. And, I've heard this all my life. This is the most important election of our lifetime. I've heard it every single election. It's true. Every single one of them is. But this one, there's a lot more at stake now than I realized before I did this research. And what I'm seeing is an escalation of the playing out of that Marxist philosophy in I think it's like the fourth or fifth generation of people who have been raised with less of a Christian worldview, less of a Judeo-Christian founding than ever before. It's taken several generations to do this. And this generation, what I'm noticing is that they are hungry for truth. They're eager for transparency. They want to talk about everything. Everything's on the table. Nothing is taboo. And they also are they want to be championing some cause. And so the causes that they are choosing to champion are the causes that are being presented to them by the cultural Marxist as worthy. Now, these worthy causes are save the planet, be who what you want to be. And it actually is removal of God from their overall view of the world. And it also has an aspect of mental and spiritual anarchy. So their definition of freedom is don't tell me who I am or who I should be. Don't tell me what I should do. There's no respect for authority. The family structure is and this is according to Antonio Gramsci, who wrote from his prison cell that the family unit is the authoritarian structure and miniature that they were trying to take out. So they have
Mm.
been targeting the family unit. But it is an anarchy of the mind and the spirit that is now resulting in people hurting their own bodies, in increase in suicide rate. Drug addiction is rampant. You get this mentality of freedom is what I want to do, and nobody else can tell me what to do. That is not true freedom. And I think that's what we really need to implement in our homes and the culture that we create, first of all, in our heart, but also in our homes. And the culture that we create is with, it can be compared to, I was thinking about this morning, it can be compared to the Spider-Man movie where it says, with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm.
With
Yeah.
great freedom comes great responsibility. Freedom is not given to you so that you can be an anarchical demonstrator and burn down a city. That's not freedom. Freedom is actually a discipline of the mind and heart that allows you to bless and encourage others and be light to the world. That's freedom. And that takes a certain discipline of following what God lays out in his word. And there's so much freedom in Christ that we have, but freedom to become more like him and not to lift any type of restrictions on us, because those restrictions are there for our safety. And our children are at risk right now, the great risk. And so in this election, I think that is what is at stake. It is a worldview that is at stake. And we see the worldview being played out by those who are in control in Washington right now. We see it being played out in the lives of our own children. And we all know, I mean, I've talked to people who are not religious at all, who are gravely concerned about the status of our culture. They don't know what's going on and they're so confused. Why is everything in upheaval? And to be able to, talk about it in this book and to share with you, there's a reason this is happening. And we have to be not only aware, but we also have to be vocal. We have to be bold and we have to be active. So in my book, I talk about my 7 times great grandmother as I did my research. She was a Quaker lady, came here as an immigrant, and never thought she'd be involved in helping with a revolution. But her first cousin, Anthony Wayne, who was a general under George Washington, asked to encamp at her house during the winter of Valley Forge. She
Oh,
lived right close to Valley Forge. And so she said, yes, you can camp here with your men. And she took care of them and she fed them and cared for the sick and the wounded. And she saved 3 lives from firing squad because they were deserters and they were condemned to death. And she went to General Wayne and she called him Cousin Wayne and she said, please spare their lives. And he did. But on her deathbed, having helped with that and other things throughout her life, the last thing she said to her family has impacted me. And I hope it's a blessing to you. But she looked up and she said, be valiant for truth.
mm.
Well, that's what we need right now. We need truth. And it's not my truth or your truth or his. No, there's one truth. And we need to know that truth. And then we need to be valiant for it.
What an incredible legacy. That's amazing. What
Such a
is
blessing. Yeah, I know.
when you came across the story, it must be wow. And it's certainly the genes carry on into your family as you have described.
Well,
Well,
it's a big responsibility too when you read something like that and you think, wow, it impacted me for the rest of my life. And
absolutely.
so it's important that we know where we came from. I
Mm.
mean, there's other stories that I'm not going to share with you are kind of embarrassing in my family history, but that was one that really
Sure.
kind of got me.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to learn more about those. And yes, we all have those family members that we're like,
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not sure. I don't
The
know.
guy that the
Uh,
guy that died in a bar fight and they never found his body, I mean, I'm not going to talk about
yeah,
that one.
yeah. We'll talk about grandmother. Be valiant,
Right, yes.
valiant for the truth. That's good. So I think what you've set out is so important. And I know American Christians get tired of this rhetoric. I think part of it is the Christians that are in public life. Sometimes we're almost desperate. Like, please see what's going on. It it does show up in a political way, but it truly is as you've described. And I was blessed because podcast listeners are familiar with our concept of the freedom fight. It truly, like most of what's going on in our society, is a fight over these 2 views of freedom. And we use the same word, we mean entirely different things. And it's really a question of whose view of truth is going to win out. And something I really appreciate about you, Christy, is that you are involved politically. This is a big element of what your family does, but you're also back here creating culture in the Barnes of Napanee, writing plays. And so a lot of Christians, I think, look at this as an either or. Like, okay, either I'm, preaching on Sunday and I'm helping build my church, or I'm this political activist. And
Yeah.
what you're setting on the book is like, no, no, no. This is stewardship. This is one aspect of what we do, and it's really important right now. And so I just appreciate that very practical take on it.
Awesome.
I know we're kind of close to time. I'd love to hear maybe just a little bit of what you learned because you're not just an idea person. I really try in my life not to just be the person writing a book. Like, I've never done it myself, but here's three ways you should do it.
Yeah.
It's so you're a practitioner. And so what were some lessons maybe that you gleaned from perhaps the time in Congress, but also at the state legislature?
Oh, wow. I think I learned that the process, and I'm the type of person who, if there's a good idea, I want to get it done and let's do it. Let's do it right now. And I learned the process is slow and meticulous, and there's a reason behind it. I remember being very frustrated the first time my husband was trying to pass a very good bill. And I thought, well, this should be a no-brainer. I mean, this is easy. Everybody should climb on board with this. Same thing with the first bill I tried to pass. And I found opposition. And I thought, what is this? Why would they oppose this idea? I thought this would bring people together. And what I found was that the process is meant, and I talk about the bill making process in the book, like how a bill becomes law and what your legislator goes through as they do that. But I learned that it's meticulous and it's tedious for a reason. And that reason is if it was easy to pass a law, first of all, we'd be strapped with so many laws we couldn't see straight. But second of all, it might not be vetted thoroughly in order to be able to stand as a good law for people across the board. So it's really important that we have everybody come to the table. And, in the book, it is nonpartisan. I want you to decide for yourself where you come down on the issues and present it that way. But at the same time, I don't think we should back down from our beliefs. We should all come to the table with our beliefs and have a healthy dialogue. So I learned that you have to be patient. The other thing that I learned is that when you are in the process of forming an idea into a proposal that hopefully will become a law, and you're making the case for why this needs to be done. I was the original author for the Protects Women's Sports Bill. It was way before it was a major problem in America, but it had been a major problem in England and I believe Sweden and several other places. Well, I was having to make the case to people on the committee that was going to hear it for why we needed this bill and why it was necessary. Well, that took me a good year and a half just to lay the foundation for it. Why? Because I had to get into the arena and make the case and debate about it and have my facts in order and share it with people and have that dialogue. So it's really important from different perspectives to come to the table and say, but what about this issue? I remember watching a committee meeting and this was before I served, it was when my husband served, and it was mostly men on the committee and one woman. And there was a lot of discussion, but she hadn't said anything. And when the woman spoke up, she brought a perspective that really helped to create a 3D perspective of the issue. It was all of a sudden, oh, yeah, we hadn't thought about that. So having so many diverse perspectives and life experiences and backgrounds coming to the table and analyzing something and saying, but if we pass that, it could be detrimental to this sector, or actually it's going to help over here. That's all helpful. So I really learned to be patient in the lawmaking process. And then the other thing I learned was that when a constituent comes to you with an issue that they're concerned about, a lot of times they have been given information of where the bill stands in the process. And it might not be accurate because the process changes a lot. My bill might end up being an amendment on another bill, and there might be a reason for it. I did that with a law that I was trying to pass to protect us from federal dollars being taken away, and it ended up working better as an amendment to the budget rather than a standalone bill. And so when I was approached about it, someone was like, but no, it's a bill. And this is what, and I said, no, actually, it's amendment. And there was an argument back and forth over where it stood in the process. Well, just if you talk to your legislator, realize that it's a process that changes as you go through it. And so the legislator who is working on it is going to have the most up-to-date information on where it is in the process. So if you've been given information about it from, a group that you're a part of or something, just be aware that they might say, well, actually, no, I had to send that over to the Senate. I'm not an author anymore. Accept it, and just say,
Right.
oh, okay, well, how best can I promote what I'm trying to promote, and ask them for next steps, because a lot of times you get very passionate about what you believe,
Mhm.
and why you want to see this happen, and come with a sense of willingness to understand what the legislator is going through on your behalf, and also where it is in the process. And you'll get further that way, because you're learning the process with them, and you're coming alongside of them and helping them.
It's such a great reminder. And I really think it fits into the theme of your book, which is, understand the process. And when you come in like screaming at someone and they're like, no, that's not even where it is anymore, or that's
Yeah,
not even what this bill was trying to accomplish,
right.
that's less than helpful to the system. So grateful for that reminder. The title of your book intrigued me, and that was The Spiritual Price of Political Silence. And my take on kind of what is that spiritual price is primarily that if Christians don't speak up in public life, we sing the signal, which the world is trying to convey, that our faith only really matters within the walls of our church, and it doesn't impact the broader society. But what did you have any other thoughts on kind of that title, like the spiritual price of political silence? And we're kind of in the speed round here. Appreciate your time today.
Yeah. So I see the spiritual price that we are paying right now, having come to fruition and actually been increased in the last 10 years more than I've ever seen it before. So I think it goes back to a split in the church. And the church, right around the turn of the century, decided half of the church decided we're going to focus only on our mission of evangelism. Politics, we're just kind of walking away from that as too dirty. The other half decided that uh, government was an answer. It was actually an answer to some of the things that the church was responsible for, and they handed over a lot of their responsibilities, whether it was care for the poor or the widows or anything else. There was definitely relegating responsibility to the government during that time. So I think the spiritual price we're paying right now is being played out in the lives of our children,
Mhm.
and the misunderstanding is being played out in universities and colleges, but it's also going into our kindergartens and to our school boards. There's a generation now that has been without a Christian worldview for quite some time. But the hope that I see is that there is a hunger. There's a hunger for God, and I'm starting to see pockets of renewal, spiritual renewal across the country, an awakening that's happening. So I pray that we will not choose one or the other, that as Americans, it's actually unique that we have to do both. And
Mm.
it's
That's good.
definitely doable, and it's something that we should all be involved in.
Amen to that. Well, Christy, if you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the broader Bible preaching, gospel preaching church, what would you put on it?
One of my favorite hymns starts out, "O rise, O Church of God, and put your armor on." And I
Oh,
would
wow.
probably say, God's armor was meant to be worn and used, so be valiant for
Mm.
truth.
Amen. Amen. I love that statement from your family member in the past. What a remarkable legacy. Well, Christy, thank you for all that you're doing for the kingdom, for your family as well. Thank you for taking the time to write this book, especially in such an important year. I'm looking forward to sharing with the audience and encourage the audience to pick up a copy, read it. And I especially appreciate that perspective from a busy individual with a number of different responsibilities. You didn't just say, okay, I'm going to focus on this, forget about the political piece of it, or forget about the culture forming piece of it. You're doing both. So, Christy, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. I look forward to how God's going to use this book and how we might be able to serve our fellow citizens in the year 2024.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and thank you for what you're doing. We need more voices out there like yours, so I really appreciate all that you're doing to make a difference.